With over half a century of brutal rivalries, the NFC North is always competitive. But without a Super Bowl appearance since 2010, it's been a barren run for many of the NFL's most historic franchises. These four teams all seem to be headed in the right direction, though. With four embedded head coaches and some elite fantasy talent, it's going to be another fun fantasy deep dive on the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down. Today we're talking about the NFC North. If you haven't already, make sure you like and subscribe. You can check us out on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down, on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O, and you can also check out my rankings at our website ffdfantasyfootball.com. Today we're going to start things off with the last team in this division to win it and then make the Super Bowl, and that was the Chicago Bears.
The Chicago Bears select Caleb Williams.
The Chicago Bears have agreed to terms with running back DeAndre Swift.
The Chicago Bears select Rome Odunze.
The Los Angeles Chargers are trading Keenan Allen to the Chicago Bears.
Fields for more. Got him! Touchdown! Bears lead. This time he goes back shoulder. This man off.
Fields wide open is touchdown Bears.
Herbert end zone touchdown. Gerald Everett.
It's been a barren run for the Chicago Bears of late. They've had one winning season and no playoff wins since 2012. They've had four coaching changes and a whole lot of quarterbacks. Is this finally the time where they settle down and start making this a winning franchise again? Well, I think so. Caleb Williams coming in is a big step in the right direction. I really like them drafting Rome Odunze. They've brought in a lot of veterans in the right positions to give them that stability, especially on the offensive side of the ball. They've been a good defensive team for the most part. They do bring in a new defensive coordinator, but it's the new OC that I'm most concerned about. I think they've got a big win here bringing in Shane Waldron. And instead of looking at how Chicago performed last year, where they were realistically one of the most run-heavy teams in the league, let's instead look at what happened with Seattle. Seattle were very pass-heavy, but they were also the slowest team in the league when it comes to plays per game. I'd expect an increase in big games, but I'd expect their play speed to slow down a little bit. There'll be a lot of pre-snap motion. I think that Keenan Allen's going to be the main guy doing that. They did use a lot of 12 and 13 personnel in Seattle, but there were a lot of O-line injuries, and I think they were trying to make up for that. That was despite the fact they had three talented wide receivers. So that essentially meant they were taking guys like Jackson Smith-Njigba off the field in order to get some extra tight ends on there. I don't think that's going to happen here. The Bears have three talented wide receivers. I think we're going to see a return to a lot more 11 personnel because they don't need to be that heavy to get the run game going in this situation. I would expect that Waldron probably favors that inside run game, and that's a little bit of a concern because that's not really the strength of DeAndre Swift. So it'll be interesting to see how Waldron comes in and makes the necessary changes to make this kind of mixture of players a success. I think he's the right guy to do that. I think this is a good win for the Bears getting him in. And frankly, Matt Eberflus needs some success because we know how quickly the Bears are willing to move on from head coaches. If you look at their main fantasy additions and fantasy losses, you've got to say that they've upgraded across the board. And so the fact that they finished with a 7-10 record last season, the fact that they bring in an improved OC, and the fact they bring in a lot more talented players, you'd have to think the playoffs might be on the cards in this situation. But a lot of that is going to rely on Caleb Williams. Can Caleb Williams step up and be the talented quarterback that we all know he was in college? I've got him as my QB6. I've got him behind the five embedded guys, but I do think that he has even more upside than that. I know a lot of people are claiming bust, but if you went through and looked at my quarterback hit rate videos, and I know a lot of you did, then I think you'd have to say that the success rate of number one overall picks as quarterbacks is overwhelming. there's an excellent chance that even if he's not amazing, he's still going to be a good starting quarterback in the NFL for a long time. And in a dynasty league, that's what you're looking for. And all my rankings for this are for dynasty. That's the time of the season we're in at the moment. So I really like Caleb Williams for dynasty. He's got enough of a rushing floor. He rushed quite a lot in college. He actually took a step back in 2023 for rushing, but he still managed to have 11 rushing touchdowns. I expect that he'll be willing to scramble, but he's also willing to stay in the pocket and throw it deep. His deep passing is accurate. He's also very good in the short areas, which is something that doesn't tend to typify a lot of young quarterbacks. So I think that's really going to suit this passing game overall. They don't have any great backups, and I think that's the biggest concern around this offense in general. If Caleb Williams goes down, what's going to happen to the pass catchers? It's Tyson Bagent, it's Brett Ripien. That's real ugly. So you've got to keep that in mind when you're drafting the wide receivers and tight ends from Chicago, that if there's a Williams injury, suddenly we're in a little bit of trouble. The running backs have also had quite a bit of upheaval. DeAndre Swift comes in after they tried to make that three-man committee work last year. It got really confusing towards the end of last season. There would be a Khalil Herbert game. There'd be a Roschon Johnson game. There'd be a Donta Foreman game. I realistically don't actually know who the true backup to DeAndre Swift is, and I suspect there probably isn't one. That kind of limits the value of Herbert and Johnson, but we have seen both of them perform okay when given the opportunity. So that means that even when they move on inevitably, they might still be able to get a starting role. And that makes them worth at least rostering in Dynasty, even if they have limited upside right now. I think that Swift will be the main man, but we know that teams aren't generally willing to give Swift a heavy workload. He's very efficient when given touches, but if you give him too many, he's either going to get injured or it's going to cause him to scale back his production. So I expect they have him in that slightly over 50% snap situation. And then we see a little bit of Herbert and Johnson. I'm not sure exactly how they're going to use those guys. Neither of them really profiles as a true pass catching back. So I expect that Swift will probably be in there a lot on the later downs, and they might get Herbert or Johnson to do some of the early grinding work. And that can only be good for Swift's production. Now, the wide receiver room has had a massive improvement. DJ Moore was excellent last year. I'm not expecting another top 10 fantasy finish necessarily. He's going to lose a lot of targets to Odunze and Allen. But I think in the long term, we've seen how talented a wide receiver he can be. You get him with a good quarterback or even an average quarterback, and he's going to produce. He's going to get open. He's going to get targets, and he's very good with the ball in his hands. I think Odunze is in an awkward situation here because he comes into a room with two talented and experienced veteran receivers who are going to expect the ball. I expect that Odunze is probably going to be pretty busy in the red zone, but he's going to spend most of his time on the outside. He's not going to get as many targets as these other guys. I'm not particularly interested in him in redraft, but I'm very interested in him in Dynasty. I think that he's got a very bright future. It just might be a little bit of a rocky start. So if you're a team who's absolutely must win now and you're in your Super Bowl window, this is not the time to be getting Odunze involved. I think he's the kind of player that you're taking if you're trying to rebuild. And frankly, if you have the third or fourth overall pick where you're going to get Odunze, you're probably in a rebuilding situation. That's perfect. For me, the only question is, do I take him over Brock Bowers? Because to me, they're the third and fourth picks, and they should be the third and fourth picks in any Superflex draft, unless you're desperate for a quarterback. For me, it entirely depends on your situation and what your needs are. I think both are close to can't miss prospects. We know how good the success rate is for early round tight ends, and we know how good the success rate is for early round wide receivers as well. So if you're taking either of those guys early in dynasty drafts, you're going to end up in a good situation. I just think Odunze is going to take a little bit longer before he eventually hits. I think this whole situation with the Bears wide receiver room hurts Keenan Allen the most. He went from being the clear number one over with the Chargers and being a consistent top 10 fantasy producer to all of a sudden being potentially the number 3 receiver at some stage during the season. I do still think he's going to get a lot of targets because that's what he does, but they're certainly not going to give him those like 20-odd target games that he was having last season when it was absolutely ridiculous. He's not going to get another 150 targets this season. If you look at his targets and then DJ Moore's, and you have to give some to Odunze, and then you think, well, they're also going to check down to DeAndre Swift, and they're also going to use Cole Kmet and maybe Gerald Everett. all of a sudden it's a little bit more scary for Allen, who's not going to get as many yards per reception, and I'd expect his touchdown total to drop as well. As much as I think this offense could be very good this season, someone's going to have to lose out. I don't think it's going to be DJ Moore. I think Odunze is going to struggle initially, but then I think Allen's going to miss out a little bit later on the season. And we'll talk about the tight ends in a second. I think it's definitely going to hurt them as well. There's not really much behind these top three receivers. And I think if one of these three receivers goes down, it's actually really going to help the others. Because if you look at the guys backing them up, Tyler Scott's probably the third guy, and we saw last year he wasn't used much, even when he was the true third guy. So he would step into that role and get some slot snaps maybe, and they probably just mix in some other guys, and that's great for whichever two receivers are healthy. So there's plenty of upside here in this offense. It's just going to be hard to know exactly which players are going to get the targets on a given week. They're definitely better best ball players, but if an injury happens, all of a sudden they can be absolute studs if they're the ones that are remaining. The tight end room is ugly. I was really excited to see what Cole Kmet could do last year. I think he was pretty underrated last year, and heck, he finished as a top 12 tight end the last two seasons, and I think there was certainly the chance that was going to happen again. Then they brought in Rome Odunze and Keenan Allen, and all of a sudden, all my excitement about Kmet has gone well down the toilet. For me, he's still a talented tight end. I certainly still think there's upside based on that talent. But while he's in this offense with this target competition, he's not someone that you should really be interested in drafting. He's more of a hole for me in Dynasty and someone you can probably use on the odd week where you have an injury, but I wouldn't want him to be my starter. If I'm trying to win now, he's not someone I'm interested in at all. He's actually more of a long-term player, even though he's not exactly young. I do think that in a couple of years, he could easily find himself in a situation where he has a lot more fantasy success. It's just hard to see it happening this season. It's also made a whole lot uglier by Gerald Everett coming in. I know a lot of people were excited about Everett potentially having some good production last year. That didn't work out, and now he goes to a situation where he's the clear tight end too. I don't think they're going to be running a whole lot of 12 personnel. I talked about how much they did last year, but unless the O-line really struggles, I think that Shane Waldron probably wants to use a lot of 11 personnel, and that's going to hurt Everett. So while he was productive at times last year, it was mostly on a volume basis rather than an explosiveness basis. I think he's the clear number two, and he only steps in and becomes useful if Kmet goes down. Even then, I wouldn't want him for fantasy. So that's the Chicago Bears. Let's next talk about the NFC runners-up last season, the Detroit Lions.
And no Amon-Ra St. Brown. He's cramping back in the locker room. Got from the middle. The corner caught it. How on earth did he catch that? He's got a first down. First down. Got protected. Going end zone. Reynolds. Hangs on. Touchdown. Approaching through to the end zone. Detroit touchdown. On that offensive line, they're still trying to pound the ball forward with Gibbs. And a first down. And Jahmyr Gibbs. Goff looking deep, wants it all. Jamison Williams looking for the ball. Got it! Touchdown!
Last season, the Lions had their first 12-win season since 1991, and only the second in franchise history. Is this the year where they finally get into a Super Bowl? Well, I think they've got all the talent. Dan Campbell has done a fantastic job of bringing in the right personalities, bringing in the right play style and the right players to suit his style and what he wants out of this team. They've finally taken steps in the right direction. And if you look at how they're using their salary, the young, talented players, they're paying their quarterback a heap, but everyone else are just good, solid players that they've drafted in the last few years. And that means they have a big pile of cap space if they need to use it. In fact, realistically, the fact that they're challenging now with so much cap space is really impressive. And I do think, honestly, that they can probably add some more talent. They haven't really lost many players this season. They've lost a couple of wide receivers, and that's a little bit of a concern because, as you can see, they've brought in practically nobody. I think that we should be expecting one or two signings somewhere around the start of the season if they're going to really challenge. If not, I think it might be difficult for them to take that one extra step. We saw last season that their play speed was really quick, and that was fantastic for fantasy. They were often getting in high-scoring games, which meant that they scored the fifth most points, but they conceded a lot of points as well, and that's really good for fantasy. They were running the ball a lot, especially around the red zone, and that meant that it was Jahmyr Gibbs that was getting the most of the benefits, and David Montgomery, of course. I would like to see them pass the ball a little bit more and get the ball to Amon-Ra St. Brown and use Jared Goff just a little bit. Having said that, that didn't stop Sam Laporta from being the number one tight end in fantasy in his rookie season. So there's a lot of talent here. There's a lot of fantasy upside as well. Let's have a look at the quarterback who's running it all. And frankly, he's been pretty average for fantasy. His accuracy has certainly improved, especially in the medium to deep zones, but I think we were all expecting a little bit more when he was drafted very early by the Rams. He hasn't really put it all together, even though he's had some good seasons, but he's more of a game manager these days. Despite the fact they're often chasing games, they don't really get him to air it out. He also doesn't offer much on the ground, and that really limits his fantasy upside. So because this is such a run-heavy offense, and because Goff's not running himself, he's really only a super flex option in fantasy. Having said that, he has been a top 10 quarterback the last 2 seasons. He does have that ability to stay healthy, but I don't think you can rely on them chasing games as much as they did last season and having such a high play speed. So even though there is that ability for him to get a lot of yardage and touchdowns because of how much they're scoring, I'm concerned that there's going to be a little bit of regression on that front, and we're going to see him go back into that more of that 10 to 20 game manager kind of area. Even if he's able to stay healthy for the whole season. It'll also be really interesting to see what happens with Hendon Hooker. I know a lot of people had high hopes for him last season after he got drafted while injured. I think that at this stage, we're seeing that he really is more of a backup for them. I think they've seen that they're happy with what they've got in Jared Goff. They've given him that big contract. I expect this is Goff's backfield, and that's why he at least has some dynasty value for me. Now, the running back room is where all the value is. Jahmyr Gibbs is the main guy. He was excellent in his rookie season. David Montgomery was heavily involved as well, but I do think that we're going to see this transfer across to Gibbs a whole lot more. I think that Montgomery will still be busy, especially around the goal line and early down work, but Gibbs is going to get a whole lot of value touches. They're going to be trying to get explosive plays out of him. He was going over 5 yards per attempt last season. I expect that continues. They're also going to scheme him up into a whole lot of screen passes and other situations where they're checking down to him, getting him into space and letting him be explosive. He had over 50 receptions last season, and given how few wide receivers they brought in, I expect that continues. He's a top 5 running back for me, and I think he has upside. There are certainly not many players I would take ahead of him in dynasty drafts if I'm trying to win in the near future. Obviously, in dynasty, you do want to value wide receivers higher, but if you're stuck at running back and you're sorted at every other position, Gibbs is the kind of player you can try to go out and get. Having said that, you're going to have to pay through the nose for him because I think a lot of people are expecting a step up from him this season. Where it becomes interesting is we talk about Montgomery and we say, well, what do we expect from him this season? I expect just less of the same, I guess. Certainly a lot of those goal line carries, certainly probably more carries per game than Gibbs initially, and Gibbs slowly takes over as the season goes on. But it's that lack of receptions and that lack of consistency that makes him a little bit scary as a fantasy prospect. I frankly like both of these guys a lot better in best ball, but because they've got those upsides, because they're going to have those boom weeks, they're both guys that you want on your fantasy rosters for now. Gibbs is the real value guy, but Montgomery's probably still got a couple of seasons of being productive left in him. And if he moves on to another team, and teams are willing to see, oh, look, this is what he could do at the Lions, he can do it for us as well, then there's certainly also fantasy value there as well. And for that reason, he's someone that you still want to have on your dynasty roster. It's a little bit unclear who their third running back is. It's probably technically Craig Reynolds. They did bring in Sione Barkey, but he's a running back / safety prospect, which is a little bit weird. We don't see those two-way players that much these days. It's unclear exactly how they're planning on using him. Are they planning on using him on both sides of the ball? I truly don't know. We're going to have to wait and see what happens. It's going to become a little bit more clear once the actual training camps start rather than all this off-season stuff. I just don't think we're going to learn enough from what's coming out of there. I don't trust what they're saying yet. I think we need to wait and see. Regardless, you don't want either of these guys. If Gibbs or Montgomery goes down, the other one becomes extremely valuable and no one else has any value at all. We saw that last season with Craig Reynolds. You'd literally need 2 injuries, and even then, I think they either bring in a veteran or it becomes a really ugly committee. So it's those top 2 guys and nobody else. The wide receiver room also has 2 guys and nobody else. The Lions have used a lot of depth. They tended to use 7 or 8 wide receivers reasonably regularly over the last couple of seasons, but now they've gotten rid of Josh Reynolds, and we've also not got Marvin Jones there anymore. And I think that probably means that technically Khalif Raymond is the third wide receiver. The problem is he spends most of his time in the slot, and you know who else spends a lot of his time in the slot? Their number one receiver, Amon-Ra St. Brown. So it's kind of hard to know exactly what this wide receiver room is going to look like. For that reason, I'm very high on St. Brown. We saw how good he has been the last 2 seasons. He was a top 3 wide receiver last season. I expect he's probably going to be top 5 again, maybe higher, if he can stay healthy, and he usually has been able to in the past. This is going to filter through St. Brown and through Laporta and through the run game, and there's not going to be much else. I do think they're going to try to get a lot more out of Jamison Williams this season. There certainly have been early reports to suggest that'll be the case. I know that this is his 3rd year, but he realistically hasn't actually been healthy at any point. I think this is probably going to be the first chance we get to actually see how he can perform as a healthy wide receiver. He was fantastic in college, and he certainly would have been a first-round pick if he was totally healthy coming into the draft. I think the Lions got a real bargain, and now they've got to actually make it work with him and develop him properly now that he's healthy. It might not be immediately at the start of the season that he produces, but I think over the course of the season, he's going to be someone that you want in your dynasty roster, even if you're not willing to waste a bench space on him in redraft. Do you want any of these other guys? Well, no, not really. Donovan Peoples-Jones is probably going to be the outside deep threat when they don't have Raymond in the slot. Raymond's obviously the slot guy, and it wouldn't surprise me if they cycle in a whole lot of Green and Kennedy. They basically use their bench guys quite a lot, mainly as blocking guys, because they do like to run the ball so much. So St. Brown is someone you desperately want on your roster. Williams is someone I'm very interested in if you can get him cheaply. Everyone else is a no-go for me. Now, Sam Laporta had a massive breakout last season. I wasn't personally surprised at all. Towards the end of the preseason, I had him well inside my top 15 tight ends in redraft, and I also had him very, very high in dynasty as well. I was right on him. I was also very high in Kincaid and Mayer, so 2 from 3 ain't bad. I do think Laporta is going to remain a very talented tight end. It was an excellent tight end class last year. This year's class is very weak, with the exception of Brock Bowers. But I think we've been a little bit spoiled in what we've received from tight ends. It's not normal to have tight ends come in and have explosive rookie seasons. It'll probably happen with Bowers. It happened with Laporta. But for the most part, outside guys like Evan Ingram, who kind of came into a situation where there was no target volume, it's very unusual for a rookie tight end to be so good in their rookie season. That should give you a lot of, I guess, positivity around Sam Laporta. I'm very bullish on him. I think he's going to be very good over the coming seasons. He's my clear number 1 tight end. And I say that loving Brock Bowers a lot. They're number 1 and 2 for me. They're both going to be excellent tight ends in this league for a long time to come. Behind Laporta, there's absolutely nothing. There's no backup that you should be taking here as if he's going to take over that role. We saw what happened before Laporta. When there was no Laporta there, it was just absolutely nothing. There was just a big committee situation. They want a talented tight end. They did it with Hockenson a few years ago, and they're going to do it again this season with Laporta. Now, that's the Detroit Lions. It's time to move on to the team that has my favorite Aussie colors, the Green Bay Packers.
The Packers are expected to sign Josh Jacobs.
Interesting.
Dumps it off to Josh Jacobs. Breaks a tackle with those strong legs. And along the sidelines, he's out of bounds.
Love on 3rd down. Rolling to his right now, takes off. And will pick up a 1st down and more.
Love's protected. Love's got Watson deep down the field. What a grab! Love over the middle. It's caught by Reed. Still on his feet. Jaden Reed in a field goal position.
There's a good run by Roy. Breaking tackle. Marshawn Lloyd. Love's pass complete. Musgrave.
2nd down. Up the sideline goes Tucker Kraft. Kraft still going. Leaping. Toe tapping. And in.
Now, I know from firsthand experience that any team wearing green and gold is going to be amazing. That's been the case for the Packers for a long, long time. They just keep on rolling on winning seasons and getting into the playoffs, and I expect that's going to keep happening with Matt LaFleur. He really got a lot out of Jordan Love last season. I think that's going to continue. They've not had a lot of turnover in general. Their main turnover has been in the running back room, and that's a good situation to have turnover. You want your running back staying young and being explosive. Now, excuse me. To be fair, Josh Jacobs, not particularly young, but he's still in his mid-20s, and I think he's going to be very good. They bring in Marshall and Lloyd, and everyone else has consistency. Basically, they've got the same quarterback, got the same wide receivers, got the same tight ends. That's perfect for what you want to do when you're building an offense. And they've even upgraded their kickers because, frankly, they desperately needed to after last season, Carlson being very disappointing. They were pretty consistently good last season. They were top 12 in points scored, despite the fact they had a low play per game rate. I am concerned that that high efficiency is going to drop off a little bit, and we're going to see a little bit of regression. But we've seen the Packers do this for quite a few years now, where they have low play counts and they still just manage to be very good on the plays that they're using. They're also the youngest team in the NFL, and they have a heap of cap space. So I feel like this is a situation where they probably should be taking advantage a little bit of that opportunity to get into a win now window. I do know that Jordan Love's going to need to get paid at some time pretty soon, but there's still plenty of space to be bringing in good free agency guys and trying to really make this team elite rather than trying to just totally build yourself. So I'm a little bit disappointed they haven't done a little bit more of that, especially on defense, but I really like what they've done with the offense because they were so good last season. Now, Jordan Love had a surprising top 5 finish last season. I did not see this coming. This totally came out of left field for me. I still don't really know what to make of it. He wasn't amazing. He was very good in the short areas, but his deep balls were just kind of okay. PFF is very generous with their gradings of deep balls. Most quarterbacks will be in the 90s because they don't expect much. They just expect you to get into the general area, and they'll consider that to be accurate. And Jordan Love is lower than most starters in the deep areas, but he's very good in the short to medium areas. That led to him being solid for most of last season. I expect the same thing continues, but I'm not expecting the same insane consistency. I think it's going to be very difficult for him to be another top 5 quarterback. In fact, I think it's going to be surprising if he's a top 10 quarterback. I think this was a little bit of an outlier season, and I expect that we see him regress quite a lot into just being a solid fantasy quarterback. I know a lot of people are excited after what happened there, and they're going out and trying to get Love, thinking that this is going to be the new normal for him. I just don't think it is. I think, if anything, you're overpaying if you're trying to get Love. Now, if I was a Jordan Love owner, I'm probably trying to sell him off to somebody who's a little bit overexcited. I think his lack of true rushing floor is going to be a little bit of a liability for him, because we know that quarterbacks, as they age, will have that rushing floor drop, and he started with a fairly low one to start with. So I would rather go elsewhere for my quarterback, but I do think there's plenty of fantasy talent in this team nonetheless. Running back is going to be very interesting. Josh Jacobs, for me, is probably going to be the clear number 1 guy. I think they're trying to replicate that Aaron Jones, AJ Dillon situation where they have 2 solid running backs, but they no longer consider Dillon to be a solid running back, and so they brought in 2 new guys. I think Josh Jacobs is the main guy, and he offers them a little bit more flexibility than Aaron Jones. Aaron Jones is very good at receiving the ball and making use of open space. Josh Jacobs is a little bit better after contact and has a little bit more of an all-around skill set. And I do think that there's upside there, though I do think they're probably going to want to use Lloyd and maybe a little bit of Dillon for more of the receiving work, or in Dillon's case, the really heavy grinding early down work, like 3rd and short, 2nd and shorts, things like that. It'll be interesting to see how they mix these guys. I've projected Jacobs to be getting the lion's share of the carries. Lloyd kind of comes in as that number 2 guy, and if he looks good, I suspect he probably becomes fantasy relevant, but more so as kind of a running back 20 to 30 sort of region, rather than a true starting running back that you want to start every single week. We have seen plenty of teams make use of 2 running backs and be successful. We've seen it in Detroit recently, for example, talked about that just before. I think that's possible, but I think it is more likely that we see Jacobs being the guy that you want for fantasy, but more as a running back 2, and Lloyd being the guy that's more of a backup and could be very productive if Jacobs goes down. AJ Dillon is not fully droppable. I do think that there is a chance that he's productive, if not here, then somewhere else in the next season or 2. but I wouldn't want to hold him outside deeper dynasty leagues where there aren't any better options available. The wide receiver room was really interesting last year. Christian Watson was injured for much of last year. Romeo Doubs looked good at times, but essentially really took a step back despite having a high snap count. Jaden Reed was the clear number one guy, and he was only out there on a little bit more than 50% of snaps. He was very strange. He was very efficient when given the opportunity. I kept expecting him to either regress back or get more snaps, and neither really happened. I think that we probably do see him out there a little bit more next season, but I think he probably starts off with about 2/3 of the snaps, and that slowly grows a little bit. He is mainly their slot guy, but they've got a lot of guys capable of playing the slot. I think they probably use quite a bit of Dontavian Wicks as well, as they did last season. Certainly, if they have an injury, he slots in as a clear number one option, but even when not, I still think he's going to be out there on about 1/3 of the snaps. And that essentially hurts all of these wide receivers. They don't have a true number one guy who's out there all the time and making targets happen. Reed's kind of very useful when he's out there, but they scheme him into positions rather than him being a true elite number one. Christian Watson has upside, but with hamstring injuries, it's so hard to trust that they're not just going to keep coming back. And that really limits his, reliability for me, even though he certainly has upside. Romeo Doubs, I think, is just a number 3 guy for them, and I think that's not going to change. He's going to be out there a lot, but I don't think he's ever going to be more than a top 40 sort of wide receiver, and that lack of upside is why I've ranked him low. I do think he's going to finish higher than the wide receiver 60 most seasons, but not high enough to make him worth starting in fantasy. There's also a lot of depth guys who we've seen take the field recently. You shouldn't be interested in any of these guys because you need a number of injuries. And while that happened last season, I wouldn't be relying on it. It's also interesting to see a quarterback there on their wide receiver depth chart. He's transitioned across to quarterback, from quarterback to wide receiver, Alex Magoo. It is what it is. What you going to do, Magoo? Now, the tight ends, this is also very interesting. We saw last season Luke Musgrave looked very good. I had a lot of high hopes on Luke Musgrave. I thought he was very talented coming out of college and realistically wasn't that far behind the top 3 guys. The top 3 being Mayer, Laporta, and Kincaid, of course, not in that order. I thought that Musgrave was kind of going to be close to them in production. It didn't really turn out that way. He was pretty solid early in the season. Then he got injured. Tucker Kraft took over. Obviously, he's a 3rd-round guy. He looked solid as well. And then when Musgrave came back, he never really took over the starting role again as they went into the playoffs. I think that Musgrave probably comes back and ends up being the starter, but I also do think there is a world where we see this be a committee. I don't think it's likely that Kraft is just going to be the number 1 tight end for them. I think that's highly unlikely to happen. I think it's either a committee or it's Musgrave. Musgrave, therefore, is a guy I'm interested in rostering. Kraft's really just there as one of the top handcuffed tight ends, and I think if Musgrave goes down, Kraft certainly has some value, but if he doesn't, you're talking about a guy that you're not interested in Dynasty at all. Musgrave, on the other hand, I think if he can get that true number 1 role, there is something here for him to be able to produce, at least as a low-end number 1 tight end. So, the last team we need to talk about today is the Minnesota Vikings.
The Minnesota Vikings select J.J. McCarthy.
J.J. McCarthy looking over the middle. Touchdown, Wolverine! Edwards with a step. He's got it.
Haven't had to put out a depth chart or anything like that, but yeah, I would say Sam. Sam would be the guy I would look to.
2nd and 14 for Darnold. Comes up throwing, Ronnie Bell. Off the fake, fires, caught in traffic. Jefferson.
2nd and 14 at the 48. Oh, what a strike. Oh,
Justin Jefferson
on the run. Jefferson will not be caught. It's a touchdown.
Could be a freebie. Cousins to the end zone. It is caught. Jefferson for another touchdown. Pressure on Cousins. Steps up. Throws deep downfield. Caught. And that's the rookie Addison.
It's not strange at all. It's football.
It's heavy pressure from San Francisco. Makes a good cut. Oh, Aaron Jones. What a run. Ty Chandler, who had a solid first half, sees the rock. Good cut. Bounces outside. The fake to Madison. The pass is caught. And Hockenson bangs his way into the end zone for a touchdown.
Just when you thought the Vikings were starting to get good, all of a sudden Kirk Cousins is out of town and they have to draft a new quarterback. They've gone with JJ McCarthy, and I think while he could be a solid quarterback, there's certainly a far lower floor than you're comfortable with. Last season, they were one of the top passing teams in the NFL, even when Cousins was injured. And yet they go and bring in a guy who's coming off a system where it was mainly run based. He didn't really have to throw the ball into tight windows. There wasn't really a lot of pressure on him in most games to carry the team. And all of a sudden, there's going to be a whole lot of pressure on him if he's starting. It's a real ugly situation, and it's disappointing because we've got so much fantasy talent in guys like Justin Jefferson, TJ Hawkinson, and Jordan Addison in this team. The upside for them is that they do have a rookie quarterback on a cheap contract. The downside is that they have the third most dead cap in the league because of Kirk Cousins. So it's a little bit of a messy situation where they can't really bring in elite free agency guys. They can't really challenge properly this season. They're kind of in that no man's land where they're not really in a true Super Bowl window, but they're not really doing an actual rebuild either. I just don't like what they've chosen to do here from a tactical perspective. I do think Kevin O'Connell is a good head coach and he'll still be able to get production out of them. And it wouldn't surprise me if they end up having another winning season and potentially even get one of those wildcard spots. It's a very competitive division though, and I think they're probably the fourth team and they're going to be on the outside looking in unless McCarthy is surprisingly good. So let's talk about the quarterbacks. So McCarthy is the guy I'm going to highlight here. I do think there's a reasonable chance that Sam Darnold's the starting quarterback at the start of next season, but I don't expect they want him to keep that job long term. I think they will transition to McCarthy at some stage, even if it's not until late in the season when they're out of the playoff hunt. Exactly what that looks like, we'll have to wait and see. But I certainly think McCarthy's the guy you want to own in fantasy, even if you get Darnold in a redraft Superflex league, just for that upside of the fact that he might potentially start because you'll be able to get him very cheap. McCarthy was, as I said, typically a game manager. He wasn't particularly good in short areas, and while he can throw deep, it was easy to throw deep with Michigan because they were always in front, they were always running the ball, and teams weren't expecting him to do it. So there was a heap of space open. They were able to kind of scheme up those situations. That's not going to be the case here. They're not going to have an amazing run game. It'll be solid, but it's certainly not going to be a case of running the ball well and then passing off the back of that. McCarthy is going to have to run that offense, and I have a lot of concerns about his ability to do that. That's why I've got him ranked quite low. It's not so much because I don't think that he can produce for fantasy. I think he actually might be quite productive in the next couple of seasons. It's just that I'm not sure that he's going to keep the job. I think going into this situation and being forced to be in a high-pressure passing situation is not ideal for a young quarterback. You kind of want to ease them into the league and help them learn. I don't think that's going to happen here. So he's going to have to really sink or swim. If he swims, he could be really good, and there isn't some upside there. But I think compared to the top three quarterbacks in last year's draft, there's certainly significantly more risk with McCarthy. If I'm not trying to win for fantasy right now, in Dynasty, I would even consider taking Michael Penix over McCarthy because I do think that he has a clearer path to long-term sustained fantasy success, whereas McCarthy could be out of a starting job within the next 3 or 4 years, depending on how things go. There is certainly a lot more risk with guys taken mid-first round compared to early first round. You can check out my QB hit rates video if you want to learn more about that. Now, the running back room's had a whole lot of change. Aaron Jones comes in, and it's an interesting move because he's nearing his 30s. He has been very good for a long time, but he started to look a bit like he was struggling with injuries last year. Certainly, he's going to be better than Alexander Madison, who was frankly a real bust. They haven't really managed to get much going since Dalvin Cook started to regress. I think Ty Chandler looked promising, but the fact they brought in Jones, I think, says a lot about how they feel about Chandler. But Jones can't stay healthy at the moment. I wouldn't surprise me if Chandler is used either to spell Jones a lot because he's rarely been an every down running back, or alternatively, obviously, if Jones gets injured, Chandler becomes valuable as well. Jones has some upside if you're in a win now window. I actually think there's a good chance he's a top 20 running back this season. So he's certainly someone you can start for the next year or two potentially. And I think that Chandler also has some upside given there is a chance that Jones goes down, and there's really nothing behind Ty Chandler at all. I don't think that Dwayne McBride's going to be particularly involved. He didn't even get a touch last year. They're certainly not going to use Nwangwu, who is a special teams guy. They might bring in a veteran if Jones has a serious injury, but I think that Chandler definitely has some upside from that perspective. Jones is the guy to own now, but from a dynasty perspective, I don't think either of these guys is particularly promising for the long term. The wide receiver room is also very interesting. It's basically Jefferson and Addison, and then just a whole lot of nothing. And there are a few wide receiver rooms that have done this. We saw this with Detroit, for example, and it can be successful because realistically, you just filter most of your offense through the same two guys. You don't need to be sharing the ball around to a lot of players. And that gives a lot of upside to Jefferson and Addison. They've just paid Jefferson a whole lot. Addison obviously looked pretty good in his rookie season, was probably the best of the rookie wide receivers last year. So certainly I think this pass game could flourish, if either McCarthy or Darnold can get the ball out effectively. That's my main concern, though. And Jefferson does drop down a little bit for me, even in Dynasty, and he drops down a lot in redraft because I just don't trust McCarthy to be able to handle the high volume passing attack that Jefferson needs to be a successful fantasy player. Obviously, when he was the overall wide receiver one, he was getting a lot of the ball, and he had Kirk Cousins, who's really aggressive, but also very talented as a quarterback. That hasn't been McCarthy in the past. It might turn out that McCarthy has that in his locker. I just don't really have high hopes for that being the case. And for that reason, Jefferson drops a little bit for me and could drop a whole lot more if things look bad early in the season. Addison also drops off a lot. He could have easily been a top 20 receiver with someone like Cousins and no one else in this wide receiver room. That's not going to be the case anymore. I think with TJ Hockenson likely out early in the season, we could see the wide receiver 3 have a little bit of brief value. I think it's probably Brandon Powell. He really profiles as more of a slot guy, but he has lined up out wide more than you would expect. It wouldn't surprise me if early on we see a fair bit of Powell involved, and then we start to see Trent Sherfield get involved a bit more. He's pretty good as kind of the third wide receiver, mainly running empty routes and blocking. He's done that pretty well for Buffalo and Miami, so it wouldn't surprise me if he plays that same role here, where he's on the outside, Powell comes in when they want someone in the slot, and they kind of cycle them that way. Jalen Naylor also potentially could be involved, but realistically, you don't want any of those guys. Everyone below there are just kind of names of guys who might be on the field, but they're highly unlikely to be valuable fantasy prospects. We're worried about Jefferson and Addison's ability to get enough of the ball. None of these other guys are going to get enough of the ball to make them even worth rostering, even in a 32-team league. I'm in a 32-team league where these guys are on free agency. These guys are on waivers, and I'm not interested in getting them there. Now, the tight end room is a little bit of a mess. TJ Hawkinson's obviously injured. Johnny Munt was the guy that came in and was the next guy up last time, which was late last season. And that also happened a couple of seasons ago as well. He does seem to technically be the backup. Josh Oliver gets on the field a little bit more when Hawkinson is healthy, but seems like they want Munt out there when they don't have Hawkinson because he's more of a reliable every down player rather than kind of a supplementary option. They also brought in Robert Tonyan, and I'm not really sure what they're doing there either. It wouldn't surprise me if they use him a little bit alongside Munt when Hawkinson's injured. Ultimately, you don't want any of these guys except for TJ Hawkinson because you don't know who the true backup's going to be. I personally think it's probably Munt. And if I was going to get somebody, because I'm in a really deep league and I just desperately need a tight end because Hawkinson's injured, I'd probably go out and get Munt. But realistically, you just want to wait until TJ Hawkinson's back. This injury is a bit of a concern, and it's unclear how it's going to affect him for the rest of the season. It might be that this is just a total lost season for him, and even when he comes back, he's pretty disappointing. And for that reason, I have dropped him a little bit in my tight end rankings. And if it does look like he's not going to come back until the latter half of the season or worse, I'll probably drop him quite a bit more. If you're in a win now window, Hawkinson is someone you probably want to be selling to get someone who can actually help you right now. And that's all we've got for the NFC North. If you've enjoyed it, make sure you like and subscribe. Make sure you hit us up on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down or Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. I answer all of your questions over there, can help you with your dynasty issues as well. You can check out my dynasty and rookie rankings at ffdfantasyfootball.com. Plus, of course, I write a lot of articles. I'm doing some podcasts now as well for Razzball too. So make sure you go and check out their stuff as well. I will be back in a couple of days for more fantasy deep dives with the NFC South. I look forward to seeing you then.